Hi everyone, Chris from Stone Age Gamer here, and this is Castlevania. It's one of my favorite NES games, and it's an extremely important NES game. This was a console-defining experience for both the Famicom Disk System and the NES here in the United States. It launched a crazy, awesome franchise that's been very successful, and this original release has been re-released dozens of times on various platforms and is readily available for just about anyone interested in getting into the Castlevania franchise. On the other hand, this is Castlevania Symphony of the Night. This specific version is, well, it's only on PlayStation. This has never been released on a Nintendo platform in the entire pantheon of video game history. How bizarre is that? On the other side of that coin, you have this. This is Castlevania for Nintendo 64, the very first 3D Castlevania game. And while it's no masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, it's not nearly as bad as its reputation would have you believe, and this has never appeared on a PlayStation or Xbox console. What I'm getting at here is that Castlevania has an extremely rich heritage, full of tons and tons of games, a lot of which are kind of stranded on their original platforms. Now, the existing Castlevania collections are great. I am thrilled that we have the Anniversary Collection and the Advanced Collection. That stuff's wonderful. But as you can see, there's still a lot of work for Konami to do. So I gotta ask, where the heck is Castlevania Collection 3? Castlevania. It's one of the most prolific game series of all time, especially during the spooky Halloween season. Konami, the company behind the brand, hasn't been most people's favorite publisher for quite some time, but one thing they've been handling with excellent care is their recent game compilations. They currently have 2 Castlevania collections on the market, and with the exception of a few weird game choices like putting Haunted Castle on the Arcade Collection with a bunch of shooters instead of on the Anniversary Collection, and including Dracula X on the Advanced Collection, even though it has just about nothing to do with the Advanced games, both collections are quite stellar. My only question is, where the heck are the rest of them? Like I said, the existing Castlevania collections are incredibly well done. They offer a heck of a good value, and while I really wish the first collection had Rewind, save states are good enough. But there are still so many important Castlevania releases missing from the current playable pantheon. If you're a fan of the series, you know there are effectively 2 kinds of Castlevania games: exploratory stuff like Symphony of the Night, and action stuff like the original Castlevania. There's also sort of a third variety, but we'll get to that later. There's no getting around the fact that there are enough Castlevania games left to fill at least 3 collections. But how to split them? There's quite a mix of these varieties left, and the split is pretty uneven, especially in terms of quality and longevity. So here's how I'd do it. Castlevania Collection 3 would be, for lack of a better title, the Symphony Collection. Yes, Castlevania Requiem exists, but these games deserve better, and this is where we would do that. The headliner is obviously Symphony of the Night, which is more or less the crown jewel of the Castlevania franchise, and one that has had several interesting revisions over the years. Where Requiem has a sort of updated version that's technically the quote-unquote best out there are people like myself who want to play with the original voice actors. So for this collection, the original PlayStation version should be there front and center, iconic voices and all.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets!
And right next to it, the Saturn version that never saw release outside of Japan. And this version has a handful of key differences, including new areas, enemies, and items. The problem is that it's also tragically flawed, and it's bogged down with some nasty technical issues like slowdown, a complete lack of transparency effects. But if they could properly clean this one up, it could be a heck of an awesome thing to play through. And yes, this would finally get Symphony of the Night on a Nintendo platform, which is honestly still crazy to me how that's never happened. Then comes Rondo of Blood. These 2 games play pretty differently, but they have a direct story connection, so keeping them together makes sense, which again makes Dracula X's inclusion in the Advanced Collection all the more weird, but whatever. There's also a full polygonal remake of this game on PSP's Dracula X Chronicles, a game that didn't include Dracula X because I'm sure there's some reason, but I don't know how realistic it would be to expect that to land in a collection like this, so I have other plans for that one we'll get to later on. Next, you have to include the other Symphony-adjacent releases, starting with the amusing Castlevania Puzzle Encore of the Night. It's basically Puzzle Fighter 2 with Castlevania characters, and that's not a bad thing. Finally, Castlevania Harmony of Despair. This game originally appeared on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, and it's kind of awesome. It's a weird little co-op online game that has characters from all over the series in it. this isn't really accessible these days, and fixing that would be very much appreciated. While I'd love to see more than just those games bundled together, looking at how Advanced Collection and Requiem were handled, I don't think it's realistic to think that they'll include more than 3 Metroidvania-style games in one pack. Stylistically, these games all work together nicely, and with the different versions of Symphony on there, I think that's a reasonable cap to put on this collection. But there's still so much more to cover. Sticking with the exploratory style games, we have the 3 entries released on the Nintendo DS. Arguably some of the best games in the entire franchise, these ones would likely be sold as a single collection because they'd require the most work to be functional on modern systems. Fortunately for us all, these games didn't rely too heavily on the DS's dual screens, but each game utilized them to some extent, and in order to make these games properly playable on a single screen display, some minor tweaks would have to be made. It's for this reason that I think if they were to make this into a collection, it would just be these 3 and not a random 4th game like they did with the advanced games. And there's more than enough gameplay between these 3 releases to justify a single package price. They're gorgeous games with awesome worlds to explore, interesting storylines, and killer characters to use, especially Dawn of Sorrow, which is a sequel to the sublime Aria of Sorrow for Game Boy Advance, one of my personal favorites in the series. That's 2 collections down. Next we have what I would call the Castlevania Origins collection. This one here would contain all the odds and ends that haven't been collected already. The trouble is, what do you headline a collection like this with? The first collection was all big-name classics, the second collection was all the GBA games. My proposed Symphony collection sells itself on that all-time classics name, and the DS games, well, they sell themselves as well. Personally, front and center, I would put Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth and Castlevania Chronicles. Rebirth is a fantastic game that's unfortunately only ever been available as part of the now-defunct WiiWare service. Konami actually made 3 Rebirth games, the other 2 being the excellent Contra Rebirth and Gradius Rebirth. But those games can find their own darn collections to be on. Castlevania Rebirth is a tough-as-nails callback to Castlevania's origins as an action platformer, and it's got a crazy soundtrack that sounds like Konami's 90s arcade games to boot. As for Chronicles, this was a PlayStation port of Akumajo Dracula for the Sharp X68000, a computer that basically had no gaming footprint in the United States. It's a retelling of the original Castlevania, and it's really quite excellent. When it was released on PlayStation as Castlevania Chronicles, it included the original game, as well as an enhanced version where Simon Belmont inexplicably has pink hair. Next up is Vampire Killer for MSX. I still can't believe this wasn't on the first Castlevania Anniversary Collection. This game came out almost simultaneously with the original Akumajo Dracula on Famicom Disk System, but while it looks the same and sounds the same, it's actually a completely different game, and one that has more in common with Symphony of the Night than you might think at first glance. Where Castlevania was more of an arcade-style action game, Vampire Killer was the birth of the exploratory angle in the series. Yes, this aspect has actually been a part of Castlevania's DNA from the very start, just not on home consoles. There are keys to collect, backtracking, item upgrades, the whole shebang. It's not nearly as fun as its action-y NES counterpart, but getting this game properly localized for the first time would be such a cool thing for Castlevania fans to finally experience. Kid Dracula was on the first collection, but the Game Boy follow-up has enough unique material to make its inclusion worthy, and this is where I believe that should happen. And speaking of the Game Boy, Castlevania Legends is a game that exists. Wiped from the official canon not long after its original release, this game is still pretty fun. Not as good as Belmont's Revenge, but better than Adventure, and has some great music. Considering how late it was released, it's pretty frequently overlooked too, so again, this is a great opportunity for more people to finally play it. That just leaves a game I'm not sure even needs to be included anywhere, but what the heck, we're being completionists, let's throw Order of Shadows on there. This is a mobile-exclusive Castlevania game from way back in the day when mobile screens were small and flip phones were a thing, and, well, it's not very good. But it is interesting, so why not? And on that note, let's go ahead and dump Haunted Castle on here too. Why not, right? This game's terrible. But it should be on a Castlevania collection and not on that arcade collection, so if you're curious enough to give it a go, this would be a good way to do that. Finally, that leaves us with a dimension that Castlevania has had some pretty considerable struggles with, the third dimension. I'd call this the 3D collection, and it would obviously headline with the 2 PlayStation 2 era games Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness. Castlevania's first forays into the world of 3D gaming weren't exactly met with critical acclaim, and when Devil May Cry hit the PlayStation 2, People frequently said that Capcom had succeeded in making a 3D Castlevania where Konami had failed. This was a bit reductive to Devil May Cry though, because that game really was doing its own thing. But there were indeed aspects of that game's success that would have made for a much better 3D Castlevania experience than what fans had gotten already, which is where Lament of Innocence came in. This was the first 3D Castlevania game that properly felt like a Castlevania game, and it seems like it's been largely forgotten in modern times. Same goes for its interesting follow-up, Curse of Darkness for PlayStation 2 and Xbox. These two alone would make for an excellent package, but a 3D collection wouldn't be complete without Castlevania for the Nintendo 64. Yes, Castlevania, or Castlevania 64 as it's commonly referred to, isn't great, but it's way better than its reputation would have you believe. Castlevania and its follow-up Legacy of Darkness are not good games, but they're very interesting games and very much worth playing for Castlevania fans. Now, I could see a world where these games don't get put on a collection in favor of landing on a service like Nintendo Switch Online, but given the option to get them in the hands of players on all platforms, not just Switch owners, I think is a good thing. So my vote would be to pair them with the PS2 games. Castlevania 64 is cool, but it's got some serious issues. Legacy of Darkness corrects some of those issues, but lacks overall polish still. Again, worthwhile games, just not exactly big selling points. And since we're already pushing polygons, this is where I'd put Dracula X Chronicles version of Rondo, if at all. Yes, this leaves out Grimoire of Souls, Castlevania the Arcade, and Castlevania Judgment, and I'm sure there are other weird Japan-only Castlevania games I'm not aware of, and I didn't even sniff the Lords of Shadow series, but this is all just wild speculation. I'm not in charge of anything. In fact, if it were up to me, Grimoire of Souls is probably best forgotten by everyone. Either way, Castlevania clearly has an incredible legacy, and that so many of these games are currently unplayable on any modern hardware, even the recently defunct stuff, is criminal. These collections shouldn't just be made now, they should be made in perpetuity, because Castlevania is an important pillar in gaming history, and its legacy should be experienced by all. With so many Castlevania titles just waiting in the wind, ready to be ported to modern consoles, and ported in perpetuity to modern consoles for all time, to let everybody else experience the Castlevania franchise for all time, it's kind of crazy to me that they haven't happened yet. I understand that Castlevania and Konami, they're off to a good start. These existing collections are great, and the Advanced Collection isn't exactly that old, so I'm not really standing here being super impatient like, hey, get on it, where's my next Castlevania collection? Are they going to do all these games? Probably not. It would be wild if they did, but certain big ones like Vampire Killer for MSX, it's kind of crazy that that hasn't been made readily available to American audiences, especially considering how popular the Castlevania franchise has become. But I guess time will tell. I got my fingers crossed that Konami's going to do right by us with the Castlevania franchise. They have been putting forth an effort, and it hasn't gone unnoticed. So there you have it, folks. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you liked what you saw here today, please follow, comment, like, subscribe, and share. And let us know down in the comments, what do you think Konami should do next with the Castlevania franchise? Besides, obviously, make a new one of higher quality than, let's say, Contra Rogue Core that...
HB is actually a cyborg. I love him so much.
But it would be great to see a proper new Castlevania game, but how would you like to see the rest of the games collected? Do you think that all of the Castlevania games, good or less than good, are worthy of being collected? Do you think there's intrinsic value in just giving people the option to try these older games even if they aren't masterpieces, just to kind of see the evolution of the franchise? Let us know. We love hearing from people. We love talking about video games. It's quite literally what we do. Thanks again, everybody. On behalf of all of us here at Stone Age Gamer, keep playing games.